The Screaming Room. It was a cold December evening in the small town of Elmwood, Ohio. The air carried an unusual chill even for this time of year. Families were gathered around their fireplaces, unaware of the events unfolding just outside the city limits. Before we begin, tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it there? James Carter, a 35-year-old mechanic, lived alone in a century-old farmhouse on the outskirts of town. His wife had passed away 5 years earlier, leaving him to care for their property by himself. The house, though charming, had always given James an uneasy feeling, especially one particular room on the second floor. That night, as James finished repairing his truck in the garage, he noticed something strange. A faint sound, almost like whispering, seemed to be coming from upstairs. He glanced at the clock. 9:17 p.m. Too late for visitors, and definitely too late for his imagination to play tricks on him. Climbing the creaky wooden stairs, James felt the temperature drop noticeably. By the time he reached the second floor, his breath had become visible in the frigid air. The sound grew louder, more distinct now. It wasn't whispering anymore, it was screaming. The source came from the west wing of the house, a part of the building rarely used. Specifically, the Red Room, so named because its walls were painted a deep crimson that seemed to glow faintly in low light. James hesitated outside the closed door. The screams continued, echoing through the hallway. Taking a deep breath, James turned the brass doorknob. The door opened with a slow creak, revealing a scene that would haunt him forever. The room was empty, yet the screaming filled the space with an intensity that defied logic. James's heart pounded as he stepped inside. The wallpaper, faded but still recognizable as Victorian floral patterns, seemed to shift and move in the dim light. Shadows danced across the walls, though no source of movement could be seen. The temperature dropped further, causing James to shiver uncontrollably. He checked his watch. 9:23 p.m. Time seemed to stretch and warp within the confines of the room. The screams changed pitch, becoming more desperate, more human-like. Yet there was no one there, just the empty space and the overwhelming sense of dread. James remembered hearing stories about the previous owners of the house, a family who had lived there in the early 1900s. Rumors spoke of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths, but these were just tales, weren't they? Urban legends meant to entertain rather than terrify. As he stood frozen in the center of the room, the screams began to form words. At first, they were indistinct, jumbled sounds, but gradually, they became clearer. "Help me! Get out! They're coming!" Each phrase sent a new wave of fear through James's body. His phone, left charging downstairs, buzzed with a text message from his friend Mark. "Hey, you still up?" the message read. James considered responding, but the phone remained safely downstairs while he was trapped in this nightmare. The buzzing stopped as quickly as it started. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second stretching into eternity. 9:28 p.m. The room's atmosphere shifted again, becoming heavier, more oppressive. James's breathing quickened as he realized the screaming had stopped. Complete silence filled the space, more terrifying than the noise had been. Suddenly, the lights flickered. Not the overhead bulb, which had long since burned out, but the very air itself seemed to shimmer and pulse with an otherworldly energy. Shadows detached themselves from the walls, taking on forms that defied description, shapes that twisted and writhed in ways that shouldn't be possible. James backed toward the door, his movements slow and deliberate, every fiber of his being screamed at him to run, but his legs refused to cooperate. The temperature continued to plummet, frost forming on the window panes despite the lack of cold air entering the room. At 9:34 p.m., the door slammed shut behind him. The sound reverberated through the house, shaking the very foundations. James spun around, panic rising in his chest. The handle wouldn't budge, no matter how hard he pulled or pushed. The room had sealed itself off from the rest of the world. The shapes in the corners of the room began to move closer. Their forms solidified into something resembling human figures. But not quite. Eyes glowed with an unnatural light, mouths stretched impossibly wide. Whispers filled the air once more, surrounding James on all sides. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice trembling despite his attempt to sound authoritative. The whispers responded, though no actual words could be discerned. Instead, they formed a cacophony of sound that threatened to overwhelm his senses. Time lost all meaning. Minutes stretched into hours, or perhaps it was only seconds. James couldn't tell anymore. His watch had stopped functioning, the hands frozen at 9:36 p.m. The room seemed to expand and contract, changing size and shape with each passing moment. Then, without warning, everything went silent. The shadows retreated to the corners, the temperature returned to normal, and the door opened easily when James turned the handle. Stepping out into the hallway, he found nothing unusual waiting for him. The rest of the house remained calm and quiet. But the experience had changed James. He couldn't sleep in that house anymore. Within a week, he had sold the property and moved to another state. To this day, the current owners refuse to enter the red room. They've boarded it up, sealing it off from the rest of the house. Sometimes, late at night, people walking past the old farmhouse claim to hear screams coming from within, though no one dares to investigate. The legend of the screaming room lives on, whispered among the residents of Elmwood. A reminder that some places are best left undisturbed. The story ends where it began, with a cold December evening in Ohio. But now, whenever someone hears an unexpected sound in the night, they think twice before investigating. Because sometimes, the truth is far more terrifying than any urban legend. Pause here for reflection. Let the weight of the tale settle in the listener's mind. The final word lingers in the air, fading slowly into silence. He wasn't on the guest list. It was a chilly October evening in rural Vermont, where the small town of Willow Creek prepared for its annual autumn festival. The leaves had turned into fiery shades of red and orange, carpeting the ground beneath towering maple trees. The air carried the faint scent of wood smoke mingled with pumpkin spice, creating an atmosphere both cozy and mysterious. Rachel Thompson, a local schoolteacher in her early 30s, had volunteered to help organize this year's event. She stood near the entrance of the community center, clutching a clipboard filled with names and details. The golden hour light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the parking lot as families began arriving for the festivities. "Good evening, Mrs. Peterson." Rachel greeted a familiar face, checking off another name from her meticulously organized list. "Your grandchildren must be excited about the haunted house tour tonight." As the line of visitors grew longer, Rachel noticed a tall figure standing silently at the edge of the parking lot. He wore a dark overcoat that seemed out of place in the crisp but not freezing weather. His presence felt different, though she couldn't quite articulate why. Perhaps it was the way he remained motionless while everyone else bustled about, or how his gaze seemed fixed directly on her despite the distance. "Excuse me," came a voice behind her, startling Rachel from her thoughts. She turned to assist another family, but when she glanced back toward the parking lot moments later, the man was gone. Shaking off an inexplicable feeling of unease, she returned to her duties. The festival proceeded smoothly throughout the evening. Children laughed as they navigated the hay maze, couples strolled hand in hand through the pumpkin patch, and elderly residents shared stories around the bonfire. Yet Rachel couldn't shake the image of that strange man from her mind. Several times, she caught herself scanning the crowd, searching for his distinctive silhouette. Around 9 o'clock, as the last scheduled events drew to a close, Rachel began directing volunteers in the cleanup process. The temperature had dropped noticeably, and a thin mist crept across the grounds, swirling around lampposts and benches. Most attendees had already departed, leaving only a few stragglers enjoying the final moments of the celebration. "Rachel," called Mark Harrison, one of the event coordinators, "have you seen anyone still wandering around?" I thought I heard footsteps near the old storage shed. A chill ran down Rachel's spine that had nothing to do with the cooling night air. No, everyone should be accounted for by now. She hesitated, then added, but earlier, there was this man. I never saw him approach the registration table. Mark frowned, adjusting his flashlight beam. That's odd. Let's do a quick sweep of the area before we lock up. Better safe than sorry. They split up to cover more ground, agreeing to meet back at the main entrance in 15 minutes. As Rachel made her way past the deserted food stalls and silent game booths, she couldn't help but notice how different everything looked under the dim security lights. Shadows danced eerily along the building's walls, and every rustle of leaves sounded like approaching footsteps. Suddenly, she froze. There, near the edge of the woods, stood the man in the dark overcoat again. This time, he wasn't merely observing, he was watching her intently, his expression unreadable in the poor lighting. Her heart pounded against her ribcage as she tried to recall if she'd ever seen him before in town, but something about him felt wrong. "Hello?" she called out tentatively, taking a cautious step forward. "Can I help you with something?" Instead of responding, the man tilted his head slightly, almost like a curious animal studying its surroundings. Then, without warning, he turned and disappeared into the tree line. Rachel's breath caught in her throat. She knew she should alert Mark immediately, but curiosity propelled her forward instead. Maybe she could catch up to him and ask what he wanted. The forest path leading away from the festival grounds felt impossibly darker than it should have been. Moonlight struggled to penetrate the dense canopy above, and Rachel found herself relying heavily on her phone's flashlight app. Twigs snapped underfoot, and the occasional owl hooted in the distance, heightening her sense of isolation. After walking for what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably much less, she emerged into a small clearing. And there, standing perfectly still amidst the encroaching darkness, was the man once more. Up close, she realized his features were remarkably ordinary. Brown hair, average build, plain face, yet somehow profoundly unsettling. His eyes reflected her phone's light in an unnatural way, almost glowing. "You shouldn't be here," Rachel managed to say, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to sound authoritative. "This is private property." For the first time he spoke, his voice low and measured. "I'm looking for someone. They told me I'd find answers here." "What kind of answers?" she pressed, inching backward slowly. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she forced herself to maintain eye contact. "Who are you looking for?" He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a photograph. Even from several feet away, Rachel recognized the faded image instantly. It showed a young woman who bore a striking resemblance to herself. Same hair color, similar facial structure. Only the style of clothing suggested it was taken decades ago. "My sister," he said finally, his tone heavy with sorrow. "She went missing after attending one of these festivals." "That was," he paused, calculating, 2 years ago tonight." Rachel's blood ran cold. She remembered hearing vague rumors about a disappearance connected to the autumn festival, but no one ever talked about it openly. Local legends hinted at supernatural occurrences tied to the land itself, stories passed down through generations but rarely believed. Could this man truly be searching for closure after all these years? Before she could respond, a sudden gust of wind extinguished her phone's screen, plunging them both into near-total darkness. Panic surged through her veins as she fumbled to reactivate the device. When the light finally flickered back on, the man was gone. Not just stepped aside or hidden, completely vanished, as if he'd never existed. Shaken to her core, Rachel stumbled back toward the festival grounds, calling Mark's name repeatedly. Together, they searched the entire area again, finding no trace of the mysterious visitor. Later, while reviewing security footage from multiple angles, they discovered something even more disturbing. Not a single camera had captured any sign of the man in the dark overcoat. It was as though he'd slipped between the cracks of reality itself. In the weeks that followed, Rachel found herself unable to forget those haunting eyes or the photograph that seemed to bridge past and present. She began researching local history archives, determined to uncover the truth about the missing woman. What she learned chilled her to the bone. Numerous unexplained disappearances linked to the festival site over the past century. Each case involved a solitary individual vanishing without a trace during the annual celebration. None were ever solved. Despite warnings from friends and colleagues to let sleeping dogs lie, Rachel continued her investigation. Something about the man's desperate search resonated deeply within her. Perhaps it was survivor's guilt, or maybe a subconscious recognition of shared pain. Whatever the reason, she felt compelled to seek answers, no matter where the trail might lead. One moonless night, armed with flashlights and determination, Rachel and Mark ventured back to the clearing where she'd last seen the stranger. The air felt heavier than usual, charged with an almost electric tension. Leaves whispered secrets as they crunched underfoot, and shadows danced unpredictably despite the steady beams of their lights. "Do you really think we'll find anything?" Mark asked skeptically, though his grip on the flashlight betrayed underlying nerves. "This whole situation feels off." "I don't know," Rachel admitted softly, scanning the perimeter for any signs of disturbance. "But I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something important, something right under our noses." They spent nearly an hour combing the area, finding nothing but ancient tree roots and scattered stones. Just as frustration began to set in, Mark spotted something glinting faintly among the foliage. Kneeling down, he unearthed a tarnished silver locket half buried in the dirt. Inside lay two tiny photographs, one of the woman from the original picture, smiling brightly, and another of a younger version of the man in the dark overcoat, his arms slung casually around her shoulders. "Oh my God," Rachel breathed, tears pricking at the corners of her eyes. "This has to belong to her, to his sister." Without warning, the temperature plummeted dramatically, causing both of them to shiver violently. Their flashlights flickered erratically, threatening to die altogether. A deep, resonant hum filled the air, seeming to emanate from the very earth beneath their feet. And then, emerging from the shadows like a specter materializing from smoke, stood the man once more. His expression hadn't changed, but his presence felt different somehow, more solid yet simultaneously ethereal. He extended a hand toward Rachel, palm upturned expectantly. In that moment, she understood what he wanted, needed from her. Placing the locket gently into his grasp, she whispered, "I'm so sorry. We'll keep looking. I promise." For the first time since their encounter, emotion flickered across his face, gratitude mixed with profound sadness. Slowly, deliberately, he closed his fingers around the precious keepsake. As he did so, his form began to dissolve, fading away like morning mist beneath the rising sun. Within seconds, he was gone, leaving behind only silence and the lingering scent of autumn leaves. Back in Willow Creek, Rachel dedicated herself to preserving the memory of those lost souls whose stories had been forgotten by time. She worked tirelessly to ensure proper memorials were established and historical records updated accurately. Though she never encountered the man in the dark overcoat again, she often sensed his presence during quiet moments, a gentle reminder that some mysteries transcend human understanding, existing beyond the veil of our everyday lives. Every October, as the festival preparations begin anew, Rachel finds herself drawn to that secluded clearing deep within the woods. There, surrounded by whispering trees and dancing shadows, she leaves fresh flowers and a handwritten note promising continued vigilance. Because sometimes, justice isn't about solving a case or finding definitive answers. Sometimes, it's about honoring the memories of those who came before us, ensuring their voices aren't silenced forever by the passage of time. And perhaps, just perhaps, somewhere beyond our comprehension, a brother and sister are finally reunited, free from the burdens of unanswered questions and unresolved grief. Their spirits rest peacefully now, knowing that someone cared enough to remember. Voices in the cornfield, a haunting tale. It was a quiet, humid evening in late September when Emma first heard the whispers. The sun had just dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the endless rows of cornfields that surrounded her small town of Millbrook, Illinois. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and drying leaves, and a gentle breeze rustled through the towering stalks. She had always found the fields comforting during the day, their golden waves stretching as far as the eye could see. But at night, they felt different, oppressive, as if the darkness between the rows hid secrets too terrible to be spoken aloud. Emma stood on the edge of the field, hesitating for a moment before stepping forward. Her boots crunched softly against the dry soil beneath her feet. It was almost 8 o'clock, and she should have been home by now, but something had drawn her here, nagging curiosity she couldn't quite explain. Earlier that afternoon, while walking back from the general store, she'd overheard an old man muttering about strange voices coming from the cornfield. He claimed he'd heard them every night for weeks, soft murmurs carried on the wind like ghostly echoes. Most people dismissed his words as nonsense, attributing it to his age or perhaps too many years spent working under the scorching sun. But Emma couldn't shake the feeling that there might be truth to what he said. The moon hung low in the sky, its pale light filtering weakly through the dense canopy above. Shadows danced around her, shifting unpredictably as though alive. She took another cautious step deeper into the field, her heart pounding in her chest. "Hello?" she called out tentatively, her voice barely audible even to herself. Silence greeted her, save for the faint rustling of leaves overhead. She exhaled slowly, trying to calm her nerves. Maybe this was all just her imagination playing tricks on her after hearing the old man's story. But then, faintly, she heard it all whisper. Barely more than a breath, yet unmistakable. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once, weaving through the rows of corn like a phantom thread. Emma froze, her pulse quickening. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice firmer this time, though laced with unease. Again, the whisper came, louder now, closer. She turned sharply, scanning the darkened rows around her, but saw nothing except the endless maze of stalks swaying gently in the breeze. "Leave me alone!" she shouted, panic beginning to creep into her tone. The whispers grew louder still, overlapping each other until they formed a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs. They weren't human voices, not entirely. There was something wrong about them, something unnatural. A chill ran down her spine as she realized she wasn't alone. Something or someone was watching her from within the shadows. She stumbled backward, her foot catching on a root hidden beneath the dirt. With a startled cry, she fell hard onto the ground, pain shooting up her arm as she landed awkwardly. For a moment, everything went silent again. Too silent. Even the rustling of the leaves seemed to fade away, leaving only the sound of her own ragged breathing. Then, without warning, a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, impossibly so, its silhouette blending seamlessly with the surrounding stalks. Its facif, it could even be called, that was obscured by a tangle of vines and dried husks, giving it the appearance of some grotesque scarecrow brought to life. Yet it moved with purpose, taking deliberate steps toward her. Emma scrambled to her feet, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs refused to obey. She was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure rasped, its voice a guttural blend of multiple tones layered atop one another. It sounded neither male nor female, neither young nor old, just wrong. "This place doesn't belong to you." "What do you want?" Emma managed to choke out, tears streaming down her face. She wanted to look away, to close her eyes and pretend none of this was real, but she couldn't. The figure's gaze held her captive, piercing through her very soul. "The voices will tell you," it replied cryptically, tilting its head in a way that made her stomach churn. Before she could respond, it raised a gnarled hand and pointed deeper into the field. Against her will, Emma found herself turning to follow its gesture. There, nestled among the rows of corn, was a clearing she hadn't noticed before. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient stone altar, its surface stained with dark streaks that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Surrounding the altar were dozens of crude effigies fashioned from twisted branches and scraps of fabric, their hollow eyes seeming to stare directly at her. "What is this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it began to chant in a language she didn't recognize, the syllables rolling off its tongue in a rhythmic cadence that sent shivers coursing through her body. The whispers returned, louder now, drowning out the sound of the chanting. They pressed in on her from all sides, filling her ears and clouding her thoughts until she could no longer distinguish reality from nightmare. Images flashed before her eyes' faces, contorted in agony, bodies writhing in pain, screams echoing endlessly. She clutched her head, desperate to block out the visions, but they only grew stronger. Through the chaos, one word repeated itself over and over again: reap, 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 reap. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The whispers ceased, the visions vanished, the figure was gone. Emma collapsed to her knees, gasping for air as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. When she finally mustered the strength to stand, she stumbled out of the field and ran all the way back to town, not stopping until she reached the safety of her home. For days afterward, Emma avoided the cornfield at all costs. She told no one what she had seen, fearing they wouldn't believe her, or worse, that they would think she was crazy. But the memories lingered, haunting her dreams and leaving her perpetually on edge. She started hearing the whispers again, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing night. No matter where she went, they followed her, taunting her with fragmented phrases she couldn't fully understand. One evening, unable to endure the torment any longer, Emma decided to confront the source of the voices once and for all. Armed with a flashlight and a pocket knife, she returned to the field, determined to uncover the truth. The moonlight illuminated her path as she navigated the labyrinthine rows, her footsteps hesitant yet resolute. When she reached the clearing, she found the altar exactly as she remembered it, but this time, it wasn't empty. Lying atop the stone slab was a book bound in cracked leather, its pages yellowed with age. Etched into the cover were symbols unlike anything she had ever seen, intricate patterns that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed from certain angles. Her hands trembled as she picked it up, half expecting it to burn her skin or crumble to dust in her grasp. But it remained solid, heavy with secrets waiting to be uncovered. As she flipped through the pages, she discovered writings detailing rituals meant to summon entities from beyond the veil. Each entry described increasingly sinister ceremonies, culminating in a final passage written in bold, jagged handwriting: "To reap is to feed is to grow. To grow is to consume." Beneath the text was a drawing of the same figure she had encountered in the field, standing beside the altar with arms outstretched. A cold realization washed over her. This wasn't just some isolated haunting, it was a cycle, a ritual perpetuated by forces far older than humanity itself. And somehow, she had become entangled in it. Before she could process further, a familiar voice echoed behind her. "You've seen enough." She spun around to find the figure standing mere feet away, its presence radiating malice. This time, however, she didn't freeze. Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she lunged forward, driving the pocket knife into its chest, or rather, where its chest should have been. The blade passed harmlessly through the air, leaving the figure unharmed. "You cannot kill what does not live," it sneered, reaching out to grab her wrist. Pain shot through her arm as its grip tightened, forcing her to drop the knife. "But you can join us." "No!" she screamed, thrashing wildly in its grasp. Desperation fueled her movements, and she managed to break free, stumbling backward toward the edge of the clearing. Without thinking, she hurled the book into the air, watching as it landed squarely on the altar. Sparks erupted from the pages, igniting a fire that spread rapidly across the dry wood. The figure let out an unearthly shriek, its form flickering like a dying flame. "You don't know what you've done!" it roared, dissolving into smoke as the flames consumed the altar. Within moments, the entire clearing was ablaze, the heat searing her skin as she fled back toward the safety of the town. When she emerged from the field, coughing and covered in soot, she expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt emptiness, a void left behind by whatever force had been unleashed. The whispers were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that weighed heavily on her shoulders. She knew deep down that destroying the altar hadn't ended the cycle, it had merely delayed it. Years later, residents of Millbrook would speak in hushed tones about the night the cornfield burned. Some claimed they saw shapes moving among the ashes, their forms indistinct yet undeniably present. Others reported hearing faint murmurs carried on the wind, though no one dared investigate further. As for Emma, she left town soon after, unable to bear the weight of what she had witnessed. But wherever she went, the memory of those voices followed her, a reminder that some secrets are best left buried. The last passenger never got off. It was a cold, damp night in the small town of Millbrook, nestled deep within the woods of upstate New York. The air carried an eerie stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. Somewhere near the edge of the forest, the old train station stood abandoned, its wooden structure warped and weathered by time. Paint peeled off the sign that once proudly announced Millbrook Station, now barely legible under layers of grime and neglect. Few people ventured here anymore, except for curious teenagers daring each other to explore its haunted history, or so the rumors went. On this particular evening, a group of 5 friends decided to visit the station as part of their weekend adventure. They had heard tales about strange occurrences at the sight whispers of passengers who never disembarked from the final train to pass through decades ago. None of them truly believed in ghosts, but the thrill of trespassing on forbidden ground was too tempting to resist. Among them were Emma, a skeptic with a sharp tongue; Daniel, her boyfriend, who loved anything supernatural; Mia, the quiet one who always seemed lost in thought; Jake, the joker whose laughter could fill even the darkest spaces; and Olivia, the cautious one who often served as the voice of reason. They arrived just after sunset, parking their car a mile away to avoid drawing attention. The walk to the station felt longer than expected, the path illuminated only by the dim glow of their flashlights. Shadows danced along the trees, creating shapes that looked almost human if you squinted hard enough. As they approached the station, the atmosphere grew heavier, as though the very air resisted their presence. "This place gives me the creeps," Olivia muttered, clutching her flashlight tightly. "Are we sure this is safe?" "Oh, come on," Daniel replied, his tone teasing yet reassuring. "What's the worst that could happen? A ghost shows up and asks us to leave?" He chuckled nervously, though no one else joined in. Emma rolled her eyes. "Let's just get this over with. I want to see what all the fuss is about." Inside the station, the floorboards creaked beneath their feet, protesting every step they took. Dust coated every surface, and the scent of mildew filled the air. Graffiti covered the walls, crude messages scrawled by those who sought to leave their mark on the forgotten building. But something else caught their attention, a series of faded photographs pinned to a bulletin board near the ticket counter. Most were black and white images of smiling families, boarding trains, snapshots of happier times. However, one photo stood out among the rest. It depicted a lone figure standing on the platform, face obscured by shadows despite the bright sunlight behind them. "Who do you think that is?" Mia asked softly, pointing to the mysterious figure. No one answered immediately. Instead, they stared at the image, feeling an inexplicable chill run down their spines. Jake broke the silence with a forced laugh. Probably just some weirdo who didn't want to smile for the camera. But his attempt at humor did little to ease the tension. The longer they lingered, the more unsettling the station became. Strange noises echoed through the empty hall-soft footsteps, faint whispers, the occasional groan of metal shifting somewhere unseen. At first, they dismissed these sounds as tricks of the mind, products of their overactive imaginations fueled by fear. Yet as the minutes passed, the disturbances grew louder, more distinct. "Did you hear that?" Olivia whispered, her voice trembling. She pointed toward a set of double doors leading to the tracks outside. Everyone froze, listening intently. Sure enough, there it was again, a low, rhythmic clanging, like the sound of a bell being struck repeatedly. "That's not coming from inside," Daniel said, frowning. "It's coming from the platform." Against better judgment, they followed the noise, stepping cautiously onto the weathered wooden planks of the platform. The clanging stopped abruptly as they emerged, leaving only the oppressive silence of the night. Their flashlights scanned the area, revealing nothing out of the ordinary. Just empty tracks stretching into the darkness, surrounded by dense woods. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. Not the natural kind caused by faulty wiring or stormy skies, but a deliberate pulsing, as if the station itself were alive and breathing. Each flicker cast distorted shadows across the platform, making it impossible to tell whether something or someone was lurking just beyond the reach of their beams. "What the hell is going on?" Emma demanded, her bravado faltering. Before anyone could respond, they heard it. The unmistakable rumble of an approaching train. "But there aren't supposed to be any trains running here," Mia stammered, clutching Daniel's arm. "It must be a freight train or something," Jake suggested weakly, though he sounded far from convinced. The rumbling grew louder, accompanied by the piercing screech of metal grinding against metal. And then, emerging from the darkness, came the train itself. Its headlights cut through the gloom, blinding them momentarily. When their vision adjusted, they realized something was wrong. The train looked ancient, its paint chipped and faded, its windows clouded with grime. It moved impossibly slowly, as though struggling to stay on the tracks. As it drew closer, the group noticed another detail that sent shivers down their spines. Every single window was dark. No passengers sat inside, no conductor waved from the caboose. It was completely empty, or so it seemed. Okay, Olivia said quickly, backing away. "We need to go. Now." "No arguments here," Jake agreed, already heading back toward the station. But before they could retreat, the train came to a halt directly in front of them. The doors slid open with a deafening hiss, revealing the interior bathed in shadow. From within, they heard a soft melodic whisper that seemed to echo in their minds rather than their ears. "Come aboard!" it urged, gentle yet insistent. None of them moved. They stood rooted to the spot, paralyzed by a mix of fear and curiosity. "Don't listen to it," Emma shouted, snapping them out of their trance. "Whatever you do, don't get on that train." Her words seemed to break the spell. One by one, they turned and ran, fleeing back toward the safety of the station. But as they reached the entrance, they realized something was terribly wrong. The building they had entered earlier was gone. In its place stood a vast expanse of wilderness, stretching endlessly in every direction. Panic set in as they frantically searched for a way out, but the forest seemed to shift and change around them, trapping them in an endless maze. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, exhaustion forced them to stop, collapsing onto the damp earth beneath the skeletal branches of towering trees. And that's when they saw it again, the train, waiting silently on invisible tracks. One by one, they began to disappear. First, it was Jake, who wandered off alone in search of help. Then Mia, lured away by the promise of finding shelter. Next came Olivia, driven mad by the constant whispers she swore only she could hear. Finally, Daniel succumbed to despair, convinced he would find answers aboard the train. Only Emma remained, clinging to the hope that she could escape whatever malevolent force had ensnared her friends. But as dawn broke over the horizon, casting pale light across the desolate landscape, she found herself standing on the platform once more. The train loomed before her, its doors wide open, inviting her to step inside. Tears streamed down her face as she realized the truth. She would never leave. Like the others, she was destined to become one of the last passengers, the ones who never got off. The forest fell silent again, save for the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. Somewhere near the edge of the woods, the old train station stood abandoned, its wooden structure warped and weathered by time. Paint peeled off the sign that once proudly announced Millbrook Station, now barely legible under layers of grime and neglect. Few people ventured here anymore, except for curious teenagers daring each other to explore its haunted history, or so the rumors went. They said the house was empty. The small town of Ridgewood, nestled deep in the heart of New England, had always been a place where whispers carried farther than voices. It was late autumn, and the air was crisp with the scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. The sun was setting behind the jagged tree line, casting long shadows over the quiet streets. A young woman named Emily Carter had just returned to her hometown after years of living in the city. She had come back for one reason: to settle the estate of her late uncle, a man she barely remembered from her childhood. Emily parked her car in front of the old house on Maplewood Lane, its peeling paint and sagging porch giving it an air of abandonment. She stepped out of the car, her boots crunching softly against the gravel driveway. The house stood at the edge of town, surrounded by dense woods that seemed to lean inward, as if trying to swallow it whole. Locals had always avoided this place, calling it cursed or haunted. But Emily dismissed such tales as superstition. "It's just an old house," she muttered under her breath, though her voice trembled slightly. "Nothing more." She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out the key her lawyer had given her earlier that day. The metal felt cold against her fingers as she inserted it into the lock. With a creak that echoed through the stillness, the door swung open. The interior was dark, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and decay. Emily fumbled for the light switch, her hand brushing against the rough texture of the wall. When the overhead bulb flickered to life, revealing the dusty furniture and cobweb-covered corners, she let out a shaky breath. "Not exactly homey," she said aloud, attempting to mask her unease with sarcasm. As she began to explore the house, her footsteps echoed ominously on the creaky wooden floors. Each room she entered seemed frozen in time, filled with relics of a life long forgotten. In the kitchen, yellowed newspapers lay scattered across the counter, their headlines faded but still legible. On the dining table sat a single plate, untouched and covered in a fine layer of dust. Something about the scene made Emily's stomach churn. It was then that she noticed the faint sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. Her heart skipped a beat. "Hello," she called out, her voice wavering. "Is someone there?" Silence greeted her words, broken only by the distant rustle of trees outside. Shaking her head, she tried to convince herself it was just the wind or the settling of the old house. But deep down, she couldn't ignore the creeping sensation that she wasn't alone. Determined to finish what she'd come here to do, Emily climbed the staircase, each step groaning beneath her weight. At the top, she found herself facing a long hallway lined with closed doors. One of them stood slightly ajar, a sliver of dim light spilling out onto the floor. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who could possibly be here?" she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and curiosity. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a rocking chair in the corner, swaying gently as if someone had just gotten up from it. Emily froze, her eyes darting around the space. There was no one there, yet the movement of the chair defied explanation. She backed out slowly, her pulse racing. By the time she reached the bottom of the stairs, night had fallen completely. Shadows danced across the walls, cast by the flickering light of the single bulb above her head. Emily decided to call it a night, retreating to her car to retrieve her overnight bag. As she crossed the threshold once more, she felt a sudden chill run down her spine. The temperature in the house had dropped noticeably, despite the lack of windows being open. She wrapped her arms around herself, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was steadily growing within her. Setting her bag down in the living room, she lit a few candles to supplement the weak electric light. That's when she heard a soft whisper, so faint it might have been her imagination. Leave. Her blood ran cold. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice stronger now, though her hands were shaking. No response came, but the whisper repeated itself, louder this time. "Leave while you can." Panic rising, Emily grabbed her phone and dialed the local sheriff's office. The operator assured her they would send someone over immediately, but as she hung up, she realized how isolated the house truly was. By the time help arrived, anything could happen. Minutes passed like hours as she sat huddled on the couch, clutching a flashlight. Every creak of the house sent her nerves spiraling. Finally, headlights appeared in the distance, cutting through the darkness. Relief washed over her as two officers stepped out of their patrol car and approached the house. "Evening, ma'am," one of them said, tipping his hat. "You reported some trouble?" Trying to steady her breathing, Emily explained everything: the footsteps, the rocking chair, the whispers. The officers exchanged skeptical glances but agreed to take a look around. They searched every room, shining their flashlights into every shadowy corner. "Seems clear to me," the taller officer said finally, scratching his chin. "Old houses like this tend to make noises. Probably nothing to worry about." "But I know what I heard," Emily insisted, frustration creeping into her tone. "We'll keep an eye on things tonight," the other officer promised, though his expression suggested he didn't believe her. "If anything else happens, give us a call." With little choice but to accept their assessment, Emily watched them leave, the sound of their car fading into the distance. Alone again, she locked the door and barricaded it with a chair, hoping to feel safer. But sleep eluded her, and the night stretched on endlessly. Sometime after midnight, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You shouldn't have come back." This time, Emily saw something move in the corner of her vision. Whirling around, she caught a glimpse of a figure standing in the doorway before it vanished. Her scream pierced the silence, echoing through the house like a banshee's wail. Desperate, she grabbed her car keys and bolted for the door, not caring about leaving her belongings behind. The cool night air hit her face as she stumbled toward her car, tears streaming down her cheeks. Back in town, she checked into a motel, unable to stop shaking. The next morning, she went straight to the library, determined to uncover the truth about the house. After hours of digging through old records and newspaper clippings, she discovered something chilling. Decades ago, a family had lived in the house: a mother, father, and their young daughter. Tragedy struck when the parents died under mysterious circumstances, leaving the child orphaned. Neighbors claimed the girl had gone mad, wandering the woods until she disappeared without a trace. Some believed she had taken her own life. Others whispered of darker forces at play. Armed with this knowledge, Emily returned to the house one final time, accompanied by a priest recommended by the librarian. Together, they performed a blessing ritual, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers throughout the building. By the end, Emily felt a strange sense of peace settle over the house, as if a weight had been lifted. Though she never fully understood what had happened, Emily left Ridgewood shortly afterward, vowing never to return. The house remained empty, its secrets buried beneath layers of history and myth. Yet, on certain nights, townsfolk swear they can still hear faint whispers carried on the wind, warning those who dare to venture too close. They said the house was empty. Emily often reflected in the years that followed. But sometimes, emptiness is the least of your worries. And so, the legend of the house on Maplewood Lane lived on, a testament to the mysteries that linger in the shadows of small-town America. She answered a phone that wasn't there. It was a quiet, overcast afternoon in the small town of Cedar Ridge, nestled deep within the Appalachian foothills. The sky was a uniform gray, and the air carried a damp chill that seemed to seep through every crack in the old houses lining Elm Street. Emily Carter, a reserved librarian in her late 20s, had just returned from her weekly grocery run. She lived alone in a modest two-story home at the edge of town, its white paint peeling slightly but still charming in its own way. As she stepped inside, she noticed something unusual, a faint ringing sound echoing through the house. Her brow furrowed as she set down her bags. "That's strange," she muttered under her breath, glancing around the living room. She didn't own a landline phone, nor did she have any devices capable of producing such a clear, mechanical ring. It wasn't her cell phone either. It lay silent on the kitchen counter, screen dark. The ringing continued, steady and persistent, as if demanding attention. Emily hesitated for a moment, then followed the sound. It seemed to be coming from upstairs. Each step creaked beneath her weight, amplifying the eerie atmosphere. The hallway upstairs was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the worn carpet. The ringing grew louder, more insistent, until she found herself standing outside the door to the spare bedroom, a room she rarely used. With a deep breath, she turned the doorknob and pushed the door open. Inside, the room was exactly as she'd left it last. Dusty furniture draped with old sheets, a single window letting in muted light. But there, sitting on the floor, in the center of the room, was an old rotary phone. Its black cord snaked across the floor like a serpent, disappearing into the wall where no outlet existed. Emily froze, her heart pounding in her chest. This phone hadn't been there before, she was certain of it. Yet here it sat, ringing insistently, almost tauntingly. Against her better judgment, she approached it. The closer she got, the colder the air became, until her breath formed tiny clouds in front of her face. Her hand trembled as she reached out, hovering inches above the receiver. Finally, she picked it up and pressed it to her ear. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, there was only silence on the other end. Then came a soft, distorted voice, barely human. "Help me!" it rasped, each word dragging out like a mournful wail. "Please, help me!" Emily dropped the phone, stumbling backward until she hit the wall. The voice continued, growing louder and more desperate. "Who are you?" she cried, clutching her arms tightly around herself. "What do you want?" But the voice didn't answer directly. Instead, it began to chant, repeating the same phrase over and over again. "Find me, find me, find me." Suddenly, the line went dead. The room fell silent, except for the sound of Emily's ragged breathing. When she looked back at the phone, it was gone. Vanished without a trace. Later that evening, Emily sat at her kitchen table, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rational part of her mind insisted it had been some kind of hallucination or prank. But the icy sensation that lingered in the spare bedroom told her otherwise. She poured herself a cup of tea, hoping the warmth would calm her nerves. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows and adding to her unease. Unable to shake the memory of the voice, she decided to investigate further. She pulled out her laptop and began searching local archives, looking for anything unusual tied to her house or the surrounding area. After hours of digging, she stumbled upon an article from decades ago. It described the disappearance of a young woman named Clara Bennett, who had vanished without a trace one stormy night. According to the report, Clara had been seen arguing with someone near the edge of the woods behind what was now Emily's property. No body was ever found, and the case remained unsolved. A chill ran down Emily's spine as she read the details. Could the voice belong to Clara? And if so, why had it chosen her to hear its plea? The next day, Emily visited the town library, hoping to learn more about Clara's life. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Percentive. Hargrove recognized the name immediately. "Oh, yes, poor Clara," she said with a sad shake of her head. "Such a sweet girl. Always helping others. Some say she angered the wrong person, while others believe." She trailed off, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Believe what?" Emily prompted gently. Mrs. Hargrove lowered her voice, though they were the only ones in the room. "There are stories old ones that speak of spirits trapped between worlds. They say this land holds secrets, echoes of those who can't move on." She paused, studying Emily carefully. "Why are you asking about Clara?" Emily hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "I think I might have encountered something related to her," she admitted cautiously. "Something unexplainable." Mrs. Hargrove nodded slowly, as if she'd expected this answer all along. "If you're meant to help her, you'll know what to do. Just be careful, dear. Not everything that calls for help deserves it." That night, Emily returned home, feeling both intrigued and deeply unsettled. As she climbed the stairs to bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every shadow seemed to shift just out of the corner of her eye, and the house felt unnaturally quiet, as if holding its breath. When she reached the landing, she froze. There, once again, was the rotary phone. This time, it sat on the top step, its cord coiled neatly beside it. The sight sent a jolt of fear through her body, but also a strange sense of resolve. She knew she couldn't ignore it anymore. Kneeling down, she picked up the receiver and held it to her ear. "Clara?" she asked tentatively. "Yes," came the reply, softer this time, but unmistakably the same voice. "You hear me. You must find me." "Where are you?" Emily demanded, her voice trembling. "In the woods. Follow the path. Look for the tree with the red ribbon." Before Emily could ask more questions, the line went dead again. The phone disappeared from her hands, leaving her staring at empty space. The following morning, armed with determination and a flashlight, Emily ventured into the dense forest behind her house. The path she followed was narrow and overgrown, the trees towering above her like silent sentinels. The air smelled earthy and damp, and the only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath her boots and the occasional rustle of unseen creatures. After walking for nearly 20 minutes, she spotted a massive oak tree with a faded red ribbon tied around its trunk. Her pulse quickened as she approached. At the base of the tree, partially hidden by moss and roots, was a small wooden box. With shaking hands, she opened it. Inside was a collection of personal belongings, a tarnished locket, a handwritten letter, and a photograph of a smiling young woman who bore a striking resemblance to the image of Clara she'd seen online. Tears welled up in Emily's eyes as she realized the significance of her discovery. These items weren't random, they were clues, pieces of a puzzle waiting to be solved. She carefully gathered them and brought them back to her house, determined to piece together the truth. Over the next several weeks, Emily delved deeper into Clara's story, uncovering a web of betrayal, jealousy, and tragedy. She learned that Clara had been involved with a man whose family disapproved of their relationship. On the night she disappeared, witnesses claimed they saw her arguing with him near the woods. Many believed he had something to do with her vanishing, but without evidence, nothing could be proven. One evening, as Emily pored over documents spread across her dining table, she heard the familiar ringing sound again. Turning slowly, she saw the rotary phone resting on the couch. This time, however, it wasn't calling Harriet, was simply there, as if waiting. Summoning her courage, she walked over and picked up the receiver. "Clara?" she said softly. "Thank you," came the voice, clearer and more peaceful than before. "You've given me peace." And then, just like that, the phone vanished. For good this time. In the days that followed, Emily felt a profound sense of closure, not just for Clara, but for herself as well. By confronting the unknown, she had faced her own fears and discovered a strength she hadn't known she possessed. Though she never saw or heard from Clara again, she knew the spirit had finally moved on. The people of Cedar Ridge eventually learned of Emily's efforts to uncover the truth about Clara's disappearance. Inspired by her bravery, they erected a memorial in the woods, marking the spot where the oak tree stood. It served as a reminder that even the most haunting mysteries could be laid to rest with compassion and perseverance. As for Emily, she continued her quiet life, forever changed by the experience. Sometimes, when the wind blew just right, she thought she could hear a faint whisper of gratitude carried through the trees. A reminder that sometimes, answering a Cleven one that comes from beyond can change everything. The Man Who Followed Me Home, a chilling encounter. It was a cold, overcast afternoon in late October when Claire first noticed him. She had been walking home from the library in her small suburban town of Crestwood, Illinois, her arms laden with books and her mind preoccupied with thoughts of the upcoming Halloween festivities. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement and the distant hum of traffic from the main road. The air carried the crisp bite of autumn, and she pulled her scarf tighter around her neck as she quickened her pace. She didn't see him at first, not really. It was more of a feeling, an awareness that prickled the back of her neck like the faintest brush of a spider's web. When she finally glanced over her shoulder, there he was, standing at the corner of Maple Street, just far enough away to seem unassuming yet close enough to make her uneasy. He wore a long, dark coat that hung loosely on his frame, its edges flapping slightly in the breeze. His face was obscured by the brim of a wide hat, but she could feel his gaze boring into her, steady and unrelenting. Claire hesitated for a moment, her breath catching in her throat. "Who is he?" she wondered aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head, chiding herself for being paranoid. Crestwood wasn't exactly a bustling metropolis, but it was safer, so she had always believed. Still, something about the man made her skin crawl. She turned her attention back to the path ahead, forcing herself to focus on the rhythmic crunch of her boots against the gravel sidewalk. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it intensified. Every few minutes, she would glance behind her, only to find him still there, maintaining the same distance as before. He never spoke, never waved, never did anything to acknowledge her presence. And yet, he followed. Step by step, block by block, he stayed just within sight, a shadowy figure trailing her like a ghost tethered to her heels. By the time she reached Birch Avenue, her heart was racing. Her house was only a few blocks away now, but the thought of leading this stranger to her doorstep filled her with dread. She considered crossing the street or ducking into one of the nearby shops, but the latter option felt futile. Most of them had already closed for the evening. Instead, she tightened her grip on her books and forced herself to keep moving, her footsteps quickening with each passing second. "Why is he following me?" she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and frustration. She wanted to confront him, to demand answers, but the words caught in her throat. What if he lashed out? What if he wasn't alone? The uncertainty gnawed at her, leaving her paralyzed with indecision. All she could do was walk faster, hoping against hope that he would eventually lose interest and disappear. But he didn't. When she finally turned onto her street, she risked another glance over her shoulder and saw him standing at the far end, his silhouette outlined against the dim glow of the streetlights. For a brief moment, their eyes met, or at least, she thought they did. Then, without warning, he stepped into the shadows and vanished. Claire exhaled sharply, relief washing over her in waves. She hurried up the driveway to her house, fumbling with her keys as she unlocked the front door. Once inside, she slammed the door shut and leaned against it, listening intently for any sign of movement outside. The house was silent, save for the soft ticking of the clock in the hallway. She locked the door and drew the curtains, her hands shaking as she moved from room to room, checking every window and peering out into the darkness beyond. For hours, she sat huddled on the couch, Her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She debated calling the police, but what would she say? That a man had followed her home without saying a word? Without doing anything overtly threatening? They'd probably dismiss her concerns as paranoia, especially since he had disappeared before she could get a good look at him. No, she decided, it was better to wait until morning. Maybe then she could convince herself it had all been a figment of her imagination. The next day, however, proved otherwise. Claire woke to find a single red rose lying on her porch, its petals glistening with dew. At first, she thought it might be a gift from a neighbor or a secret admirer, but the absence of a note or any identifying details left her unsettled. She picked it up cautiously, examining it for clues, but found nothing unusual. Still, the gesture felt wrong too, deliberate, too calculated. As she walked to work later that morning, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched again. Sure enough, when she paused at the intersection of Birch and Elm, she spotted him standing across the street, his posture relaxed, yet unnervingly still. This time, he wasn't wearing the hat, and she got a clearer view of his face. It was gaunt, almost skeletal, with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes that seemed to glint with a strange, otherworldly light. His lips curled into a faint smile as their gazes locked, sending a shiver down her spine. Claire broke eye contact and hurried across the street, her pulse hammering in her ears. She ducked into a nearby cafe, ordering a coffee she didn't really want, just to have an excuse to stay indoors. From the safety of the window seat, she watched as he lingered outside, his expression unreadable. After several agonizing minutes, he finally turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Over the next few days, the encounters grew more frequent and more disturbing. Wherever she went, he was there. At the grocery store, in the park, even outside her office building. He never approached her, never said a word, but his presence was constant, suffocating. Friends and coworkers began to notice her growing anxiety, asking if everything was okay. She tried to laugh it off, attributing her behavior to stress or lack of sleep, but deep down, she knew the truth. Something was terribly wrong. One evening, after returning home from work, Claire discovered a note tucked beneath her windshield wiper. Written in jagged, uneven handwriting were the words, "I've been waiting for you." Her stomach churned as she read the message over and over, each repetition making it feel more menacing. She crumpled the paper in her fist and threw it into the trash. But the damage was done. Sleep eluded her that night, her mind racing with questions she couldn't answer. Who was he? What did he want from her? And why wouldn't he leave her alone? Determined to put an end to the torment, Claire decided to take matters into her own hands. She installed extra locks on her doors, set up motion-activated lights around the perimeter of her house, and even bought a can of pepper spray to carry with her at all times. But none of these precautions brought her peace. If anything, they only heightened her sense of vulnerability, reminding her constantly of the danger lurking just beyond her control. One particularly restless night, she heard a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. At first, she thought it might be the wind rattling the windows, but when she investigated, she found the source of the noise. A single finger pressed against the glass of her sliding door. It was him. His face loomed mere inches away, pale and expressionless, his eyes gleaming with an intensity that made her blood run cold. Without thinking, Claire grabbed the nearest object, a heavy ceramic vase, and hurled it at the door. The impact startled him, causing him to stumble backward. Seizing the opportunity, she bolted to her bedroom and locked the door behind her, her chest heaving as she fought to catch her breath. Outside, she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps retreating into the night. The next morning, she called the police, recounting everything that had happened in painstaking detail. To her surprise, they took her seriously, promising to patrol the area more frequently and advising her to document any future incidents. For a while, things seemed to improve. The man stopped appearing in public places, and the notes ceased entirely. Claire allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was finally over. But then, on a rainy Tuesday evening, she received a package in the mail. There was no return address, no indication of who had sent it. Inside, she found a photograph of herself taken from outside her bedroom window, along with a short letter written in the same jagged handwriting as before. The message was simple yet chilling. "You can't escape me." Panic surged through her veins as she realized the implications. He had been watching her all along, studying her routines, learning her habits. The idea that he knew her life so intimately down to the layout of her home was unbearable. She packed a bag and fled to a friend's house in Chicago, hoping the distance would offer some measure of protection. For weeks, she lived in a state of constant vigilance, jumping at every unfamiliar sound and avoiding crowded spaces where she might encounter him. Yet, despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, biding his time. One night, as she lay awake in bed, she heard the faintest creak of floorboards in the hallway. Her heart stopped. Slowly, she reached for the baseball bat she kept beside her bed and crept toward the door. When she opened it, the hallway was empty, or so she thought. As she turned to go back to bed, a hand shot out from the shadows, grabbing her wrist with an iron grip. She screamed, swinging the bat wildly, but he was too strong. His face emerged from the darkness, twisted into a grotesque grin that revealed rows of jagged teeth. "You should have stayed," he whispered, his voice low and guttural. "Now you'll never be free." Claire's world dissolved into chaos. She struggled, kicked, clawed, but it was no use. His strength was overwhelming, his presence suffocating. Just as she felt consciousness slipping away, she heard the distant wail of sirens. Whether they were real or imagined, she couldn't tell. All she knew was that she had failed to escape the man who followed her home. He laughed, but no one was around. It was a quiet, overcast afternoon in the small town of Pine Ridge, tucked away in the rolling hills of rural Pennsylvania. The sky hung low and gray, casting long shadows across the landscape as if nature itself were holding its breath. Most of the townsfolk had retreated indoors to escape the chill that lingered in the air, leaving the streets eerily deserted. Somewhere in the heart of this sleepy community stood an old, decrepit house known only as the Laughing House. Locals avoided it at all costs, claiming strange noises emanated from within laughter, they said, deep and echoing, though no one lived there anymore. On this particular day, a group of 5 friends decided to investigate the rumors surrounding the house. They weren't thrill seekers or paranormal enthusiasts, they were just bored teenagers looking for something to do on a gloomy Saturday afternoon. Among them were Ethan, the self-proclaimed leader with a knack for talking himself out of trouble; Claire, the skeptic who preferred logic over superstition; Ryan, the joker whose sarcasm often masked his unease; Melissa, the quiet observer who noticed things others missed; and Ben, the cautious one who always seemed to be scanning their surroundings for danger. They arrived at the edge of the property just after 3 o'clock, parking their bikes behind a cluster of bushes to avoid drawing attention. The house loomed before them like a forgotten relic of another era, its once white paint now peeling away in large flakes, revealing rotting wood beneath. Shutters hung crookedly from the windows, some missing entirely, while vines crept up the walls like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. A weathered sign nailed to the gate read, "No trespassing," but the letters had faded so much they were barely legible. "This place looks like it belongs in a horror movie," Ryan quipped, forcing a laugh that sounded more nervous than amused. "Let's just get this over with," Claire replied, her tone clipped. She adjusted the strap of her backpack, which contained a flashlight, a notebook, and a few snacks just in case. Ethan stepped forward, pushing open the creaking gate with a loud groan. "Relax, guys. It's probably just some old pipes rattling or wind blowing through cracks. Nothing scary about that." As they approached the front door, the atmosphere grew heavier, almost suffocating. The air smelled faintly of mildew and decay, and the silence was so profound it felt unnatural. Every step they took toward the house seemed to amplify the sound of their own breathing, making them hyper-aware of their presence in what should have been an abandoned space. Melissa paused, glancing over her shoulder. Does anyone else feel like we're being watched? Ben frowned, scanning the surrounding trees. Probably just squirrels or birds. Still, let's not stay too long. Inside, the house was even worse than they had imagined. Dust covered every surface, and cobwebs hung like curtains between pieces of broken furniture. Faded wallpaper peeled away from the walls, exposing patches of crumbling plaster. In the corner of the living room, an antique grandfather clock stood frozen at 3:17. Its hands rusted into place. "This is creepy as hell," Ryan muttered, kicking a loose floorboard absent-mindedly. "Shh," Claire hissed, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" At first they thought it might be the wind, but then it came again, a low, rumbling chuckle that seemed to echo from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It wasn't a pleasant laugh either. It was hollow, almost mechanical, as though someone or something were mimicking human emotion without truly understanding it. "What the?" Ethan trailed off, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's coming from upstairs," Melissa said softly, pointing toward the staircase. "No way am I going up there," Ben declared firmly. "We didn't come all this way just to chicken out now," Ethan shot back, though his bravado wavered slightly. Against their better judgment, they climbed the stairs, each step groaning under their weight. The laughter grew louder as they ascended, reverberating through the narrow hallway until it felt like it was inside their heads. At the end of the corridor, a single door stood ajar, light spilling through the crack. "That's impossible," Claire whispered, her brow furrowing. "There are no lights on in this house." Ignoring her warning, Ethan pushed the door open. Inside was a small bedroom, its walls lined with faded floral wallpaper. An old rocking chair sat in the center of the room, swaying gently despite the absence of any breeze. On the dresser, a dusty mirror reflected their pale, frightened faces. And then, without warning, the laughter erupted, a deafening cacophony that made their ears ring and their hearts race. They spun around, searching for the source, but the room was empty. Okay, we need to leave. Now," Ben insisted, backing toward the door. But before they could retreat, the door slammed shut with a resounding thud. The laughter continued, growing louder and more distorted until it sounded less like a person and more like static on an old radio. "What's happening?" Melissa cried, clutching Ethan's arm. "I don't know," he shouted back, his voice tinged with panic. Suddenly, the mirror began to ripple, its surface rippling like water disturbed by a stone. From within, a shadowy figure emerged, its form indistinct but undeniably humanoid. Its mouth stretched impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light. "Run!" Claire screamed, grabbing Melissa's hand and pulling her toward the window. One by one, they scrambled out onto the roof, sliding down the sloping tiles and landing awkwardly in the overgrown yard below. Behind them, the house seemed to come alive, its windows pulsing with a sickly yellow light. The laughter followed them, echoing through the trees as they fled into the woods. Hours passed, or maybe it was only minutes. Time had lost all meaning. Eventually, they collapsed near a stream, gasping for breath and trying to make sense of what they had witnessed. "We can't go back," Ben said hoarsely, his face pale. "Not ever." But as dawn broke over the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, they realized something was wrong. One by one, they began to vanish. First, it was Ryan, who wandered off in search of help. Then Melissa, lured away by the promise of finding shelter. Next came Claire, driven mad by the constant whispers she swore only she could hear. Finally, Ethan succumbed to despair, convinced he would find answers back at the house. Only Ben remained, clinging to the hope that he could escape whatever malevolent force had ensnared his friends. But as he stumbled back into town, disheveled and wide-eyed, he found himself standing in front of the laughing house once more. The door creaked open, inviting him inside, and as he stepped across the threshold, he heard the laughter, deep and echoing, though no one was around. The forest fell silent again, save for the faint rustle of leaves and the distant hum of crickets. Somewhere in the heart of this sleepy community stood an old, decrepit house known only as the Laughing House. Locals avoided it at all costs, claiming strange noises emanated from within laughter, they said, deep and echoing, though no one lived there anymore. The campground that disappeared. It was late summer, the kind of season where the days stretched endlessly and the nights carried a cool breeze that hinted at autumn's approach. The small town of Pine Ridge, nestled deep within the sprawling forests of the Pacific Northwest, was known for its dense woods, winding rivers, and a history steeped in folklore. Among the locals, there were whispers of a place called Shadow Pines Campground, a remote site deep in the wilderness that had become infamous for strange occurrences. Most dismissed these tales as campfire stories meant to scare children, but not everyone believed they were just myths. Daniel Harper, a young journalist from Seattle, had always been drawn to the eerie and unexplained. He had heard about shadow pines during a trip to Pine Ridge a few years prior, but it wasn't until recently that he decided to investigate further. The stories fascinated him, accounts of hikers vanishing without a trace, strange lights flickering in the forest at night, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to permeate the area. Determined to uncover the truth, Daniel packed his gear and set out on a journey into the heart of the woods. The drive to Pine Ridge was long and lonely, the road narrowing as he ventured deeper into the wilderness. By the time he arrived, dusk was settling over the landscape, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the distant call of birds echoed through the trees. As he checked into a small motel on the edge of town, Daniel couldn't help but notice the wary glances the locals gave him when he mentioned shadow pines. "You sure you want to go up there?" the motel owner asked, his voice low and hesitant. "Folks don't come back from that place." "I'll be fine," Daniel replied with a forced smile, though the man's words lingered in his mind. "Just looking to write a story." The next morning, armed with a map, flashlight, notebook, and camera, Daniel began his trek into the forest. The path leading to Shadow Pines was overgrown, the trail barely visible beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. The farther he went, the quieter the world became. Even the rustling of animals seemed to fade, leaving only the sound of his own footsteps crunching against the ground. After hours of hiking, he finally reached the clearing where the campground was said to be located. What he found, or rather, didn't find, left him unsettled. There were no tents, no fire pits, no signs of human activity whatsoever, just an empty expanse surrounded by towering trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The air felt heavier here, almost suffocating, and a chill ran down his spine despite the warmth of the day. "This can't be right," Daniel muttered, consulting his map again. According to the markings, this was the exact spot where Shadow Pines should have been. Yet there was nothing but emptiness. As he stood there, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, he noticed something odd. Scattered around the clearing were remnants of what appeared to be old camping equipment-trusted lanterns, tattered tarps, even a child's doll half buried in the dirt. It was as if the campground had been abandoned suddenly, with no time to pack up or clean up. A sharp snap of a twig behind him made him whirl around, his heart pounding. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing unnaturally in the stillness. No one answered, but the sensation of being watched grew stronger with each passing second. Deciding to document everything, Daniel began taking photographs of the clearing and the scattered debris. As he snapped a picture of the doll, his camera emitted a strange buzzing noise before shutting off completely. Frowning, he fiddled with the device, but it refused to turn back on. "Great," he muttered under his breath, stuffing the useless camera into his bag. "Guess I'll have to rely on notes." He moved closer to inspect the doll more closely, crouching down to brush away some of the dirt covering its face. The porcelain features were cracked and weathered, but there was something unsettling about the way its glassy eyes seemed to follow him. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending a shiver down his spine. That's when he heard a faint whisper, so soft it could have been the wind. "Leave." Daniel froze, his breath catching in his throat. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling slightly. The whisper came again, louder this time. "Go now." His instinct screamed at him to run, but curiosity rooted him to the spot. Slowly, he rose to his feet and scanned the surrounding trees, searching for any sign of movement. The forest remained eerily still, yet the feeling of being watched intensified. Determined to get to the bottom of this, Daniel pressed on, venturing deeper into the woods. He followed a narrow trail that seemed to lead away from the clearing, hoping it would take him somewhere area that might provide answers. The light was fading fast, casting long shadows that danced across the forest floor. After what felt like an eternity, he stumbled upon a dilapidated cabin hidden among the trees. Its wooden walls were rotting, and the roof sagged dangerously, but it offered shelter from the growing darkness. Reluctantly, he pushed open the creaky door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit by the last rays of sunlight filtering through the cracks in the walls. Dust covered every surface, and the air smelled of decay. In the center of the room stood a rickety table, atop which lay a collection of objects: a journal, a pocket watch, and a bundle of faded photographs. Curiosity getting the better of him, Daniel picked up the journal and began flipping through its pages. The entries were written in shaky handwriting, detailing the experiences of someone who had once stayed at Shadow Pines. The writer described hearing voices in the night, seeing shadowy figures moving between the trees, and feeling an unbearable sense of dread that never lifted. One passage caught his attention. "They say the forest is alive, watching, waiting. If you listen closely, you can hear it calling your name. Don't answer. Whatever you do, don't answer." A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he read those words. Before he could process them further, a loud thud outside made him jump. Dropping the journal, he grabbed his flashlight and cautiously approached the window. Peering out into the gloom, he saw nothing but swaying branches and shifting shadows. Or so he thought. As he stared harder, he realized one of the shadows wasn't moving with the wind. It stood perfectly still, darker and denser than the others. And then, slowly, it began to move toward the cabin. Panic surged through him, and he backed away from the window, his mind racing. Should he stay and try to defend himself, or flee into the unknown depths of the forest? The decision was made for him when the front door burst open with a deafening crash. Heart pounding, Daniel bolted out the back door, not daring to look behind him. Branches clawed at his arms and face as he ran, the forest seeming to close in around him. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices that urged him to stop, to turn around, to give in. "No!" he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. "I won't stop!" Somehow, miraculously, he found his way back to the trail leading out of the woods. By the time he emerged onto the main road, dawn was breaking, painting the sky in soft pastels. Exhausted and shaken, he collapsed onto the ground, gasping for breath. When he finally mustered the strength to stand, he turned back to look at the forest one last time. Through the mist, rising from the trees, he could see the outline of the clearing where Shadow Pines had supposedly been. But now, instead of emptiness, there was something elsey, cluster of tents, flickering campfires, and figures moving about as if nothing were amiss. Blinking in disbelief, Daniel rubbed his eyes, certain he was hallucinating. When he looked again, the scene was gone, replaced once more by the desolate expanse. Shaken to his core, Daniel returned to Pine Ridge and wrote his article about Shadow Pines, though few believed his account. Over time, the story faded from memory, becoming just another tale whispered around campfires. But Daniel never forgot. On quiet nights, he sometimes thought he could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, calling him back to the campground that disappeared. And deep in the forest, the shadows waited, patient and eternal. The wrong voice on the baby monitor. It was a humid summer evening in the small suburban town of Maple Grove, Illinois. The kind of night where the air felt thick and heavy, clinging to your skin no matter how many fans you turned on. Rachel Dawson sat in the living room of her modest two-story home, absently flipping through channels on the television while trying to ignore the faint hum of cicadas outside. Her son, Ethan, just 6 months old, had finally fallen asleep after hours of fussing. She cherished these rare moments of quiet, even if they were fleeting. On the coffee table beside her sat the baby monitor, its green light blinking steadily to indicate it was active. The device was one of those high-tech models with both audio and video capabilities, though Rachel rarely used the video feature unless she needed to check on Ethan during particularly restless nights. Tonight, however, she kept the screen off, relying solely on the sound to reassure herself that all was well upstairs. At first, the only noise coming from the monitor was the soft, rhythmic breathing of her sleeping child. Rachel leaned back into the couch, letting out a sigh of relief as she allowed herself to relax for the first time all day. But then, something changed. A faint rustling sound came through the speaker so subtle at first that she almost dismissed it as static or interference. She sat up straighter, straining to listen. Probably just the wind, she murmured to herself, glancing toward the closed windows. Yet deep down, she knew that wasn't it. The sound grew louder, more deliberate, like someone or something was moving around in Ethan's nursery. Her heart began to race as she grabbed the monitor and pressed it closer to her ear. And then she heard it. A voice. Low, distorted, and utterly foreign. It wasn't her husband's voice. He was working late at his office downtown, and it certainly wasn't hers. "Who's there?" the voice whispered, its tone chillingly calm yet tinged with menace. "Why are you watching me?" Rachel froze, her blood turning to ice in her veins. She stared at the monitor, half expecting the screen to flicker to life and reveal an intruder lurking in her baby's room. But when she forced herself to glance at the display, it showed nothing but the familiar image of Ethan's crib, his tiny body curled peacefully beneath his blanket. "Hello," she called out tentatively, her voice shaking. "Is someone in my house?" There was no response, at least not immediately. For a moment, silence reigned once again, save for the gentle breaths of her sleeping son. Just as Rachel began to convince herself she'd imagined the whole thing, the voice returned, louder this time. "Closer." "You shouldn't have listened," it hissed, each word dripping with malice. "Now you'll never stop hearing me." Panic surged through her body as she bolted upright from the couch. Grabbing the nearest Objecta decorative vase from the side table, she sprinted toward the staircase, her footsteps echoing loudly against the hardwood floors. As she reached the top landing, she hesitated, her hand trembling on the railing. What if she opened the door to find... what? An intruder? A ghost? Something far worse? Summoning every ounce of courage she possessed, she pushed open the nursery door and flicked on the light. Everything appeared normal. The mobile above the crib spun lazily, casting soft shadows across the walls. The stuffed animals lining the shelves sat undisturbed, and Ethan continued to sleep soundly, blissfully unaware of the terror gripping his mother. But then she noticed something strange. On the floor near the corner of the room lay a small wooden ratalone she hadn't seen before. Its surface was intricately carved with symbols that looked ancient and unfamiliar. Where had it come from, and why did it give her such an overwhelming sense of dread? Later that night, after securing all the doors and windows, twice, Rachel sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, determined to uncover answers. The voice from the monitor replayed endlessly in her mind, gnawing at her sanity. Could it have been some kind of prank? Or was it something far beyond explanation? Her search led her to local forums and message boards, where residents of Maple Grove occasionally shared stories about strange occurrences in their homes. One thread caught her attention, a post titled "The Crying House." According to the original poster, several families who had lived in Rachel's neighborhood over the past century reported hearing disembodied voices, especially in rooms occupied by young children. Some claimed the voices belonged to former inhabitants who had died tragically within the walls of those houses. Others suggested the land itself was cursed, haunted by spirits tied to the area's Native American history. As Rachel scrolled further, she found comments from people claiming to know specific details about her street. One commenter mentioned a family named Miller who had lived in her exact house decades earlier. Their youngest child, a boy named Timothy, had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. No trace of him was ever found, and the case remained unsolved. A chill ran down Rachel's spine as she read the final comment on the thread. "If you hear him calling, don't respond. He doesn't want help. He wants company." The next morning, Rachel decided to visit the local library to dig deeper into the history of her home. The librarian, a kindly older woman named Mrs. Peterson, greeted her warmly and offered assistance when Rachel explained her research goals. After rifling through dusty archives and yellowed newspaper clippings, they uncovered a series of articles detailing the disappearance of Timothy Miller. According to the reports, Timothy had been playing in his backyard one afternoon when he vanished without a trace. Witnesses claimed they saw a shadowy figure lurking near the edge of the woods behind the property, but no concrete evidence was ever found to support foul play. Over time, rumors circulated that Timothy's spirit still wandered the house, searching for closure, perhaps revenge. Mrs. Peterson leaned in closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "People say the Millers tried everything to contact him," she said solemnly. "Psychics, seances, even exorcisms. Nothing worked. Eventually, they moved away, convinced the house was cursed." Rachel thanked the librarian and left the building feeling more uneasy than ever. If the voice on the monitor truly belonged to Timothy or whatever remained of him, what did it mean for her and Ethan? That evening, Rachel installed extra locks on all the doors and set up motion-activated cameras around the perimeter of the house. She also kept the baby monitor close at hand, refusing to let it out of her sight. Despite her precautions, the voice returned. This time, it spoke directly to Ethan. "Come play with me," it cooed, its tone deceptively sweet. "We'll have so much fun together." Rachel's heart nearly stopped as she rushed to the nursery, finding her son wide awake and staring blankly at the wall. His expression was eerily calm, almost trance-like. When she picked him up, he didn't cry or squirm as usual, he simply gazed at her with unblinking eyes. Desperate for guidance, Rachel reached out to a friend who specialized in paranormal investigations. Mark Thompson arrived the following day armed with equipment designed to detect supernatural activity. Together, they conducted a thorough sweep of the house, focusing particularly on the nursery. To their astonishment, the devices registered significant anomalies, cold spots, electromagnetic fluctuations, and faint whispers that seemed to emanate from nowhere. Mark warned Rachel that whatever presence lingered in her home was intelligent and potentially dangerous. "It knows you're onto it," he said gravely. "Be careful." Over the next few days, the disturbances escalated. Toys would move inexplicably across the floor. Lights flickered unpredictably, even when no one was home. And the voice on the monitor grew increasingly aggressive, taunting Rachel with cryptic messages meant to unsettle her. One night, unable to endure the torment any longer, Rachel decided to confront the entity head-on. Standing in the nursery with the baby monitor in hand, she addressed the empty space around her. "What do you want from us?" she demanded, her voice quivering despite her resolve. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the voice replied not through the monitor, but seemingly from everywhere at once. "He's mine now. You can't protect him forever." Tears streamed down Rachel's face as she clutched Ethan tightly to her chest. She realized then that staying in the house was no longer an option. Gathering their belongings, she fled with her son to stay with relatives in another state. Though the voice has since fallen silent, Rachel remains haunted by the memory of those nights. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind reminds her of the wrong voice on the baby monitorand, the sinister force that sought to claim her child. He smiled from inside the closet, a tale of unrelenting fear. It was a damp, overcast afternoon in late November when Emily moved into her new apartment on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon. The building was old, its brick facade weathered by decades of rain and neglect, but the rent was affordable, and she needed a fresh start after leaving her previous job in Seattle. She had always been drawn to older places, their creaky floors and peeling wallpaper imbued with stories of lives long past. Yet, as she carried the last box through the front door, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about this particular apartment wasn't quite right. The unit itself was Modesta single bedroom, a small kitchenette, and a living room just large enough for her secondhand couch and coffee table. The walls were painted a faded cream color, and the hardwood floors groaned underfoot with every step. Despite the dim lighting filtering through the grimy windows, there was an undeniable charm to the spaceor, so she tried to convince herself. But it was the closet in the bedroom that caught her attention first. It was narrow and shallow, barely big enough to hang more than a few outfits, but something about it seemed off. As she unpacked her belongings, Emily found herself glancing at the closet door repeatedly, her unease growing with each passing hour. The wood paneling was scratched and warped, the brass handle tarnished with age. She told herself it was just her imagination playing tricks on her, the result of too many horror movies watched during sleepless nights. Still, she couldn't resist testing the door, pulling it open to reveal the cramped interior. Empty hangers swayed gently, though she hadn't touched them, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Shaking her head, she closed the door firmly and returned to her task. By evening, the rain had begun to fall, tapping softly against the window panes as twilight settled over the city. Emily sat cross-legged on the floor, sorting through a box of books and photographs, her mind drifting back to memories of her childhood home in Montana. The rhythmic patter of raindrops lulled her into a sense of calm, and for a moment, she almost forgot about the nagging discomfort the closet had stirred earlier. Almost. Then, just as she reached for another stack of papers, she heard a soft click, like the sound of a latch being released. Her fingers froze mid-motion, and she turned her head slowly toward the closet. The door stood slightly ajar, though she was certain she had closed it tightly before sitting down. "Probably just the wind," she murmured, forcing a nervous laugh. She rose to her feet and walked over to the closet, her socks whispering against the floorboards. With a deep breath, she pushed the door shut again, making sure it latched securely. Back on the floor, she resumed her unpacking, but the incident left her unsettled. Every few minutes, she glanced up at the closet, half expecting it to swing open once more. When nothing happened, she began to relax, chalking it up to the quirks of an aging building. By 9 o'clock, she decided to call it a night, stacking the remaining boxes in the corner and crawling into bed with a book to distract herself. The hours slipped by unnoticed until she finally turned off the lamp beside her bed. Darkness enveloped the room, broken only by the faint glow of the streetlights outside. As she lay there listening to the steady rhythm of the rain, she felt her eyelids grow heavy. Sleep came quickly, wrapping her in its comforting embrace. Or so she thought. Sometime later, she woke with a start, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. At first, she wasn't sure what had roused her there. There was no noise, no movement, just an oppressive silence that seemed to press down on her like a weight. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A sliver of darkness where none should have been the closet door was open again. Emily sat bolt upright, her pulse racing. The room was pitch black, save for the pale light streaming through the window, casting eerie shadows across the walls. She stared at the closet, willing herself to believe it was just her imagination. After all, doors could open accidentally, couldn't they? Maybe the latch was faulty. Maybe. And then she saw it. A flicker of movement inside the closet, so subtle she almost missed it. Something shifted in the shadows, just beyond the reach of the light. Her breath hitched in her throat as she strained to see more clearly. Was someone in there? Had someone broken in while she slept? Summoning every ounce of courage, she reached for the lamp on her bedside table and switched it on. The sudden brightness illuminated the room, revealing the closet's empty interior. Nothing stirred within its confines, no sign of an intruder or anything out of place. Relief washed over her, followed immediately by confusion. If no one was there, why did she feel so uneasy? She climbed out of bed and approached the closet cautiously, her bare feet cold against the wooden floor. Reaching out, she pulled the door shut once more, ensuring it clicked firmly into place. As she turned to go back to bed, however, she heard a low, muffled chuckle emanating from behind her. It was soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakably human. Her blood ran cold as she spun around, her eyes darting toward the closet. The door remained closed, but the laughter continued, echoing faintly in the stillness of the room. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. There was no response, only the sound of her own ragged breathing. She backed away slowly, her gaze fixed on the closet, until she bumped into the edge of her bed. Without thinking, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking as she pressed the numbers. Before the operator could answer, the line went dead. She stared at the screen in disbelief. It was as if the phone had lost all power, despite being fully charged moments ago. Desperate, she grabbed a flashlight from the nightstand and aimed its beam directly at the closet. The light revealed nothing unusual, yet the laughter persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't mocking or cruel. Instead, it carried an unsettling warmth, as though someone found genuine amusement in her terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. Silence fell once more, heavier than before. Emily sank onto the edge of her bed, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. Her mind raced with possibilities, none of which offered any comfort. Was she losing her mind? Was this some kind of prank? Or was something truly haunting her new home? Unable to stay in the room any longer, she retreated to the living room, curling up on the couch with a blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. For the rest of the night, she kept the lights on, jumping at every creak and groan the building made. When morning finally arrived, she felt exhausted, both physically and emotionally drained. Determined to uncover the truth, Emily spent the following day investigating her apartment. She inspected the closet thoroughly, checking for hidden compartments or signs of tampering, but found nothing out of the ordinary. She even asked her neighbors if they had experienced anything strange, but they dismissed her concerns, attributing the noises to the building's age. Frustrated and increasingly anxious, she decided to research the history of the property online. What she discovered chilled her to the bone. Decades earlier, the building had been the site of a grisly murder-suicide. A man named Harold Grayson, described in news articles as reclusive and deeply disturbed, had killed his wife and young daughter before taking his own life in the very same apartment. According to reports, he had locked himself in the master bedroom and barricaded the door, refusing to let anyone enter. When authorities finally broke in, they found his body slumped against the closet, a knife clutched in his hand, and a disturbing smile frozen on his face. Emily's stomach churned as she read the details, her mind conjuring images she wished she could unsee. Could it be possible that Harold's spirit still lingered in the apartment, trapped between worlds? She didn't consider herself superstitious, but the coincidence was too striking to ignore. That evening, she resolved to confront whatever presence haunted her home. Armed with a camera and a digital recorder, she sat cross-legged on the floor of her bedroom, facing the closet. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an energy that made her skin prickle. She pressed record and began speaking aloud, her voice wavering slightly. "If you're here, If you can hear me, please show yourself. I don't mean any harm. I just want to understand." For several minutes, nothing happened. The room remained silent, the only sound the faint hum of the recorder. Just as she began to doubt her plan, the closet door creaked open slowly, inch by inch, until it stood wide. Emily's breath caught in her throat as she stared into the darkness, her grip tightening on the camera. From within the shadows, two pale eyes appeared, gleaming faintly in the dim light. They were accompanied by the unmistakable curve of a grin-wide, toothy, and utterly unnatural. "Harold?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. In response, the figure stepped forward, emerging fully into view. He was gaunt, his skin stretched taut over sunken cheeks, his hair matted and unkempt, his clothes were tattered, remnants of a bygone era, and his hands were stained with dried blood. But it was his smile that terrified her most, a grotesque caricature of joy, devoid of humanity. "You shouldn't have come here," he rasped, his voice a guttural blend of malice and sorrow. "This isn't your place." Emily scrambled backward, dropping the camera as she fumbled for her phone. Her fingers trembled as she dialed emergency services, but the call failed to connect. Harold advanced steadily, his grin widening with each step. "You can't leave," he said, his tone almost playful. "Not after seeing me." Panic surged through her veins as she bolted for the door, but it slammed shut before she could reach it. Trapped, she turned to face him, tears streaming down her face. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." Harold tilted his head, studying her with an expression of detached curiosity. "Too late?" he murmured, raising a bloody hand toward her. "Now you'll stay with us." The world dissolved into chaos. Emily screamed, clawing at the door in a futile attempt to escape, but her efforts were in vain. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was Harold's smile bright, unyielding, and utterly triumphant. Weeks later, the apartment sat empty, its windows boarded up and its halls silent. Neighbors whispered about the tragedy, speculating about the young woman who had vanished without a trace. Some claimed to hear faint laughter coming from the unit late at night, while others reported seeing a shadowy figure standing in the window. No one dared to investigate further. And deep within the walls of the old building, Harold Grayson smiled contentedly, knowing he would never be alone again. They moved out. Something stayed. It was late spring in the small town of Black Hollow, a quiet community nestled in the rolling hills of Ohio. The air carried the scent of blooming wildflowers, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting golden rays over the rows of modest houses that lined the streets. Among these homes stood 42 Maplewood Lane, a weathered Victorian house with peeling white paint and crooked shutters. For decades, it had been the residence of the Thompson family parents, 2 children, and their aging dog Bud. Now, it sat empty, its windows dark and its porch sagging under the weight of neglect. The Thompsons had moved out abruptly, leaving behind whispers among the neighbors. No one knew exactly why they left, only that they had packed up overnight and vanished without a word. Some said it was because of financial troubles. Others claimed the house was haunted. Whatever the reason, the property remained unoccupied for months, its presence growing more ominous with each passing day. Then came Emma Dawson, a young woman in her late 20s who had inherited the house from a distant relative she barely remembered. A freelance photographer by trade, Emma was drawn to the idea of solitude, a chance to escape the chaos of city life and focus on her work. She arrived at the house one cloudy afternoon, her car loaded with boxes and camera equipment. As she stepped out of the vehicle, she couldn't shake the feeling that something about the place felt off. The air seemed heavier here, the silence almost oppressive. Still, she reminded herself that old houses often had quirks, and this one would be no different. "It's just an old house," she muttered under her breath, though her voice lacked conviction. "Nothing to worry about." Unlocking the front door, Emma stepped inside, her footsteps echoing on the creaky wooden floors. The interior was dim, the sunlight filtering weakly through dusty curtains. Cobwebs clung to the corners of the ceiling, and a thin layer of grime coated every surface. Boxes were stacked haphazardly in the living room, remnants of the previous owner's hasty departure. Emma set down her bag and began unpacking, determined to make the space livable. As she worked, she noticed strange details about the house scratches on the walls that looked too deliberate to be accidental, faint scorch marks on the carpet, and a peculiar odor that lingered despite her efforts to air out the rooms. By nightfall, she had made some progress, but exhaustion crept in quickly. Deciding to call it a night, she lit a few candles and settled onto the couch with a cup of tea. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the loose shutters and sending shadows dancing across the walls. That's when she heard the first sound that would haunt her nights to come. A soft thud came from upstairs, followed by the unmistakable creak of floorboards. Emma froze, her teacup halfway to her lips. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. No response. She told herself it was probably just the house settling, but the unease gnawing at her stomach wouldn't subside. Setting aside her tea, she grabbed a flashlight and cautiously climbed the staircase. Each step groaned beneath her weight, amplifying the tension coiling in her chest. At the top, she found herself facing a long hallway lined with closed doors. One of them stood slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight spilling through the gap. Her heart pounded as she approached, pushing the door open with a trembling hand. Inside was an empty bedroom, its walls bare except for a single faded photograph hanging askew. The image depicted a family smiling stiffly at the camera, mother, father, and 2 children. Something about their expressions unsettled her, as if they were hiding a secret too terrible to share. Before she could examine it further, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the candle she had brought with her. Darkness enveloped her, broken only by the weak beam of her flashlight. Panic rising, she turned to leave, but stopped short when she saw the shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It wasn't human. Its form shifted and writhed like smoke given shape, its eyes glowing faintly in the gloom. Emma stumbled backward, her breath catching in her throat. The thing tilted its head, studying her with an intelligence that chilled her to the bone. Then, with a speed that defied logic, it lunged forward. Emma screamed and bolted from the room, slamming the door shut behind her. She raced down the stairs and out the front door, not stopping until she reached her car. Trembling, she fumbled with the keys and sped away, leaving the house and whatever lurked within behind. For days, she avoided returning, staying with a friend in town while she tried to process what had happened. But curiosity eventually got the better of her. Determined to uncover the truth, she visited the local library, poring over old records and newspaper clippings related to 42 Maplewood Lane. What she discovered sent a shiver down her spine. Decades earlier, the house had belonged to a reclusive man named Arthur Grayson, who was rumored to dabble in occult practices. Neighbors reported hearing strange noises coming from his home, and several children claimed to have seen monsters lurking in the woods behind the property. When Grayson disappeared without explanation, the house changed hands multiple times, each new owner leaving under mysterious circumstances. Armed with this knowledge, Emma decided to confront the entity haunting her home. She enlisted the help of a local historian named Mr. Peterson, who specialized in folklore and paranormal phenomena. Together, they returned to the house on a moonlit night, carrying sage bundles, salt, and a journal containing instructions for banishing malevolent spirits. The ritual was tense and exhausting, requiring them to chant incantations and burn herbs throughout the house. At first, nothing seemed to happen. But as they reached the final steps, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with static electricity. Shadows swirled around them, taking on grotesque shapes before dissolving into nothingness. Suddenly, a deafening roar filled the house, shaking the very foundation. The lights flickered violently, then went out completely. In the darkness, Emma felt a presence looming over her, its malice palpable. She clutched the journal tightly, reciting the final words of the incantation with all the strength she could muster. And then, silence. When the power returned moments later, the oppressive energy that had plagued the house was gone. Exhausted but relieved, Emma and Mr. Peterson exchanged wary glances. "I think we did it," he said softly, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Over the following weeks, Emma stayed in the house, testing her newfound sense of security. Though the oppressive feeling had lifted, she couldn't shake the lingering suspicion that something or someone remained. One evening, as she sorted through the remaining boxes left by the Thompsons, she found a journal tucked away in a dusty corner. Its pages were filled with frantic scribbles detailing the family's experiences in the house. They described hearing voices in the walls, seeing shadowy figures in the hallways, and feeling an overwhelming sense of dread that never eased. In the final entry, written in shaky handwriting, the author confessed, "We're leaving tonight. We can't stay any longer. It watches us. It waits. We thought moving out would end it, but I fear it will follow us wherever we go." The realization hit Emma like a punch to the gut. The Thompsons hadn't escaped, they had simply passed the burden on to her. From that moment on, Emma lived in constant vigilance, aware that the house might still harbor secrets she hadn't uncovered. Occasionally, she would hear faint whispers drifting through the halls or catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of her eye. But she refused to abandon the home she had fought so hard to reclaim. "They moved out," she whispered to herself one night, staring into the flickering flame of a candle. But something stayed. And deep within the walls of 42 Maplewood Lane, the shadows stirred once more. The note under the floorboards. Late one October evening, in a small town nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains of West Virginia, a man named Daniel Harper found himself alone in his late grandmother's creaky old house. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and aged paper, and the faint hum of insects echoed through the cracks in the walls. It had been years since he last visited this place, but after her passing, Daniel felt an inexplicable pull to return, as if some unseen force was calling him back to uncover something long buried. The house stood at the end of a winding dirt road, surrounded by towering oak trees whose skeletal branches clawed at the darkening sky. Its weathered exterior bore the marks of time-peeling paint, sagging shutters, and a porch that groaned under even the slightest weight. Inside, things were no better. Dust coated every surface, and shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. The electricity hadn't worked for years, so Daniel relied on oil lamps scattered throughout the house to fend off the encroaching darkness. It was during his second night there that it happened. Daniel had decided to clean out the attic, a task he'd been avoiding since arriving. As he shuffled through boxes filled with yellowed photographs and forgotten trinkets, he noticed a loose floorboard near the far corner of the room. At first, he thought nothing of it, just another sign of the house's decay, but curiosity got the better of him. Kneeling down, he pried the warped plank up with a crowbar he'd brought along. Beneath the board lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly into quarters. His heart thudded in his chest as he picked it up, the texture rough against his fingertips. Unfolding it revealed handwriting scrawled in faded ink, the letters shaky yet deliberate. The note read, "If you've found this, then I am already gone. They are here watching from the woods. Do not trust them. Burn the house before it spreads further." A chill ran down Daniel's spine as he stared at the cryptic message. Who wrote this? And what did they mean by they? He tried to shake off the unease settling over him, telling himself it was probably just some prank left behind by a mischievous relative decades ago. But deep down, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that something wasn't right. That night, sleep eluded him. Every creak of the house sounded louder, every shadow darker. Around midnight, he heard a soft tapping coming from somewhere below. At first, he convinced himself it was just the wind rattling the windows or branches brushing against the siding. But when the sound grew more insistent, almost rhythmic, he knew it wasn't natural. Gripping the flashlight tightly, Daniel descended the narrow staircase leading to the main floor. The beam of light cut through the oppressive gloom, revealing empty rooms and cobwebbed corners. The tapping led him to the living room, where the source seemed to emanate from beneath the floorboards. His pulse quickened as he knelt down and examined the wooden planks. One of them shifted slightly when he pressed on it, revealing another hidden compartment. Inside, he found another note, identical in appearance to the first. This one read, "You shouldn't have come back. Leave while you still can. Once they know you're here, there will be no escape." Panic bubbled up inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. "This is ridiculous," he muttered aloud, trying to reassure himself. "Just someone messing with me." Yet, as he stood there in the dim light, he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Slowly, he turned toward the window and froze. Through the glass, barely visible in the moonlight, stood a figure cloaked in shadow. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was undeniable. Daniel blinked, certain his eyes were playing tricks on him, but when he looked again, it was still there. Instinctively, he took a step back, knocking over a nearby lamp. The crash startled him, and by the time he regained his composure and peered outside once more, the figure was gone. The next morning, Daniel told himself it was all in his head. Sleep deprivation, combined with the eerie atmosphere of the house, must have conjured those hallucinations. Still, he couldn't bring himself to dismiss the notes entirely. Determined to get to the bottom of things, he began digging through his grandmother's belongings for answers. In a dusty trunk stored in the basement, he discovered a journal belonging to her. Flipping through its brittle pages, he learned about strange occurrences she documented over the years' disappearances in the surrounding woods, livestock mutilations, and whispers of a cult operating in secret. She mentioned seeing figures lurking outside the property line at night, always retreating into the forest whenever approached. One entry stood out above the rest. "They offered me a deal to leave the house untouched in exchange for silence. I refused. Now I fear they'll come for me next. If anything happens to me, destroy this place. Don't let them use it." Daniel's hands trembled as he closed the journal. Whatever his grandmother had encountered, it was real and dangerous. He resolved to burn the house down as instructed, but first, he needed proof. He couldn't risk looking like a lunatic to the authorities if he reported these events without evidence. That evening, armed with a camera and a renewed sense of purpose, Daniel ventured into the woods surrounding the property. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustle of leaves overhead. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though the ground itself resisted his intrusion. After walking for what felt like hours, he stumbled upon a clearing bathed in pale moonlight. At its center stood a circle of stones, arranged in a crude formation. Scattered around were remnants of candles, their wax hardened with age. In the middle lay a pile of bones, some human-sized, others smaller. A wave of nausea hit him as he realized what he was looking at: an altar used for rituals. Suddenly, the air grew colder, and the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. From the edge of the clearing emerged several figures, their faces obscured by hooded robes. They moved silently, surrounding him without uttering a word. One of them stepped forward, extending a skeletal hand toward him. Daniel bolted, crashing through the underbrush as adrenaline surged through his veins. Behind him, he could hear the sound of pursuit footsteps pounding against the earth, growing closer with each passing second. He didn't dare look back, focusing solely on reaching the safety of the house. When he finally burst through the front door, slamming it shut behind him, he collapsed onto the floor, gasping for breath. For a moment, everything was still. Then, Faint scratching noises began emanating from the walls, followed by low murmurs that seemed to seep through the very foundation of the house. Desperation took hold of him. Grabbing a box of matches from the kitchen, he set fire to the curtains, watching as flames quickly consumed the dry fabric. Smoke filled the air, choking him as he stumbled outside. Behind him, the structure roared with life, its timbers crackling and collapsing inward. Yet, as Daniel watched the inferno engulf the house, he noticed something unsettling. Standing among the trees, just beyond the reach of the firelight, were the figures from the clearing. Their hoods cast their faces in shadow, but he could feel their gazes boring into him. Even as the house burned to ashes, they remained motionless, silent sentinels guarding whatever secrets lay hidden within the ruins. In the days that followed, Daniel left the town behind, vowing never to return, but no matter how far he traveled, he couldn't escape the memory of those hollow eyes staring at him from the darkness. Sometimes, late at night, he swore he could hear the faint tapping of fingers against wood, echoing through the recesses of his mind. And though he tried to convince himself otherwise, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, waiting. They found footprints on the ceiling. It was a cold, overcast evening in the small town of Maplewood, Minnesota, where the air carried the faint scent of pine and the promise of an impending storm. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves blown by the wind. Somewhere in the heart of the town stood an old Victorian house, its once grand facade now marred by peeling paint and broken shutters. The house had been abandoned for decades, its history shrouded in whispers and half-truths. Locals avoided it, claiming it was cursed, but for one man named Ethan Grayson, the stories only fueled his curiosity. Ethan had recently moved to Maplewood after inheriting the property from a distant relative he barely remembered. A freelance journalist by trade, he saw the house as both a challenge and an opportunity, a chance to uncover a story that might reignite his career. Little did he know, the house held secrets far darker than anything he could have imagined. The first night he spent there, Ethan was struck by how oppressive the silence felt. Even with the hum of his portable heater and the soft glow of his desk lamp, the house seemed alive in ways he couldn't explain. The wooden floors groaned under their own weight, and the walls creaked as if shifting ever so slightly. He tried to dismiss these sounds as typical for an old building, but something about them unsettled him. Around midnight, unable to sleep, Ethan decided to explore the second floor. His footsteps echoed softly against the warped floorboards as he made his way down the dimly lit hallway. At the end of the corridor, he noticed a door slightly ajar, a room he hadn't yet investigated. Pushing it open, he found himself in what appeared to be a child's bedroom, though it had clearly been unused for years. Toys lay scattered across the floor, their colors faded with time, and a dollhouse sat in the corner, its tiny furniture covered in dust. As Ethan stepped inside, he felt a sudden chill run down his spine. The air in the room was colder than the rest of the house, almost unnaturally so. He shook his head, chiding himself for being overly imaginative, and turned his attention to the ceiling. That's when he saw them footprints. Perfectly imprinted into the plaster, they trailed across the surface as though someone or something had walked upside down. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he thought his eyes were deceiving him, but no matter how many times he blinked or tilted his head, the prints remained. They were small, like those of a child, but their placement defied logic. Or what could leave such marks? And why here, in this room? Overwhelmed by a mix of fear and fascination, Ethan snapped several photos of the footprints with his phone. He told himself he would analyze them later, perhaps even show them to someone who might have an explanation. But deep down, he knew there was no rational answer for what he was seeing. The next morning, Ethan visited the local library, hoping to find records or documents related to the house's history. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hargrove, greeted him with a wary smile. "You're staying at the old Grayson place, aren't you?" she asked, her tone tinged with concern. Yes, Ethan replied cautiously. Do you know much about it? Mrs. Hargrove hesitated before answering, glancing around as if afraid someone might overhear. That house has a troubled past, she said finally. Back in the 50s, a family lived there, the Millers. They had a daughter, Emily, who disappeared one night without a trace. Some say she ran away, others believe something unnatural took her. Ethan's stomach tightened. What happened to the family? They left soon after, Mrs. Hargrove continued. Couldn't bear to stay in the house any longer. People claimed they heard strange noises coming from upstairs, footsteps, laughter, crying, but no one ever saw anyone. After that, the house sat empty for years. Armed with this new information, Ethan returned home, his mind racing with possibilities. Could the footprints belong to Emily? Was her spirit still trapped within the house? Or was there something else entirely at play? That night, determined to get answers, Ethan set up a voice recorder and a camera in the child's bedroom. He positioned the equipment carefully, making sure to capture every angle of the room, then retreated to the hallway, leaving the door cracked open just enough to keep an eye on things. Hours passed uneventfully, lulling Ethan into a false sense of security. Just as he began to nod off, a loud thump jolted him awake. Heart pounding, he rushed back to the room and froze at the threshold. The footprints on the ceiling had multiplied, spreading out in chaotic patterns. Worse still, fresh scuff marks now marred the walls, as though something had clawed its way across the surface. A low, guttural growl emanated from the shadows, sending a shiver down Ethan's spine. He reached for the flashlight clipped to his belt, but before he could turn it on, the room plunged into darkness. The cameras and recorder went dead simultaneously, their screens blank and lifeless. "Who's there?" Ethan called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to sound brave. There was no response, only the sound of heavy breathing growing louder and closer. Slowly, he backed away, his eyes straining to adjust to the pitch blackness. Then came the footsteps, not on the floor, but above him, moving deliberately across the ceiling. Each step resonated through the room, accompanied by a faint scraping noise that made Ethan's skin crawl. He stumbled backward, tripping over a forgotten toy and landing hard on the floor. Suddenly, the lights flickered back on, revealing the room exactly as it had been before untouched, save for the additional footprints now covering every inch of the ceiling. The cameras and recorder sprang to life again, their displays blinking erratically. Desperate for answers, Ethan grabbed the devices and fled downstairs, locking himself in the kitchen until dawn. When morning finally arrived, Ethan reviewed the footage, hoping to find some clue about what had happened. To his horror, the recordings showed nothing unusual, just static-filled frames and garbled audio. Yet, amidst the distortion, he caught glimpses of movement too quick to identify, shadowy figures darting just out of view. Unable to shake the feeling that he was being watched, Ethan decided to dig deeper. He contacted a historian named Dr. Lewis, who specialized in paranormal phenomena. After hearing Ethan's account, Dr. Lewis agreed to visit the house the following evening. Dr. Lewis arrived promptly at sunset, carrying a bag filled with equipment designed to detect supernatural activity. Together, they conducted a thorough investigation, setting up motion sensors, thermal scanners, and electromagnetic field detectors throughout the house. As they worked, Ethan recounted everything he'd experienced, including the footprints and the eerie footsteps. "I've seen cases like this before," Dr. Lewis admitted grimly. "Sometimes, places become conduits for entities we can't fully understand. If your theory about the missing girl is correct, it's possible her energy is trapped here, manifesting in disturbing ways." Their conversation was cut short by a sudden drop in temperature. The lights flickered violently, casting the room into intermittent darkness. One of the thermal scanners emitted a high-pitched whine, its screen flashing wildly. "Something's here," Dr. Lewis whispered, his voice tight with tension. Before either of them could react, the unmistakable sound of footsteps thundered overhead. This time, however, they weren't confined to the child's bedroom. They echoed throughout the entire house, growing louder and faster with each passing second. Ethan and Dr. Lewis exchanged a panicked glance before bolting toward the front door. But as they reached the threshold, the handle refused to budge, no matter how hard they pulled. Behind them, the footsteps grew deafening, shaking the very foundation of the house. In a final act of desperation, Ethan grabbed a nearby chair and hurled it at the nearest window. Glass shattered and freezing air rushed in, momentarily drowning out the cacophony. Without hesitation, they scrambled outside, collapsing onto the frost-bitten grass.